Hey guys, welcome back to the exciting conclusion of why Arnold rightfully won the 1980 Olympia. And you know the controversy, we went over it last week. Menser was the bodybuilder. Mike Menser was the bodybuilder who I think was supposed to win. One of the other ones it was going to win. Menser showed up in really good shape, but Arnold shows up in bad shape 2 days prior to the competition, enters and wins. And everybody thinks it was rigged, like it's just some kind of popularity contest. To call it a popularity contest, and that's why they gave to Arnold because he was more popular, is close but way off. There's something more subtle going on here, and I think Arnold deserved to win, even though I acknowledge he was not in his best shape, not even close to being in good shape as Menser, who prior to this had got perfect scores in bodybuilding competitions. So yeah, that's what we covered last week, the 1980 Olympia controversy. Getting ahead of myself already here in the slides. And I don't think this would be as interesting. I don't think this controversy would be as interesting, except Mike Menser has an avowed philosophy. He is an avowed objectivist. Objectivism is a philosophy that I have learned a lot from, but I do think there are problems with it, and it's uncanny how the problems with objectivism show up with Mike Menser in this competition. Mike Menser is he is effectively an embodiment of this philosophy, the good and the bad. I mean, to show up in perfect condition and still lose because you don't get something. And it wouldn't be such a big deal, but I'm going to show how it's built into objectivism. Now objectivism, I'm going to move my face over here. Now, objectivism doesn't say not to get this explicitly in their philosophy, but when you adhere to their premises, the premises of that philosophy, it's going to be difficult for you. Things are going to be difficult for you. And it's too bad because I think this philosophy has a lot of good things to offer, and it's not going to be more popular because it lacks this certain thing. I know I'm being a little bit vague, but we're going to explicate it fully in this part two of this presentation. Yeah, then we also went over physical culture, how it evolved, how it was really, physical culture is supposed to be this thing that promotes itself. And that's what led to the de-evolution of bodybuilding. Is it stopped being able to promote, it stopped being able to connect with regular people. In that sense, I guess you could see Arnold Schwarzenegger as the final form of bodybuilding, of this thing that we did in the 20th century to prove a point to ourselves about how our bodies work. Do we even need to continue it? Yeah, I think it's fun, and I'm a fan of bodybuilding. But I don't know. Does it need to exist in the way that it does now? I have some questions. About it, guys. Okay, and so this week we're going to go to more specifics about what happened in the 1980 Olympia, because we're going to listen to a few clips from Mike Menser talk about it, because I think there's just treasure troves of information. As much as I can talk around what I think happened, to hear Menser talk about it, there are treasure troves there. This will lead into the problem with objectivism. It's the psychology problem with objectivism. And, this is obviously not going to matter unless we can make it mean something for you, because I think all of us eventually face what Menser faced in the 1980 Olympia. And I think very few people work through these issues 100%. Once you face an injustice like that, or a perceived injustice, you can kind of do things to work through it. And I think most guys will kind of hobble along after that. They'll get by, but they really can't mind that situation for all the gold that's in it. And I don't think Menser did. I think it may be a little bit too... It may be a little bit too excessive to say that he had a downfall. I'm trying to think of a good word for that. I don't think he had a downfall necessarily, but I mean, compare his life to Arnold's, and it just things didn't work out well for him. And you can hear in this interview that I think he still has bitterness in his voice years later after this competition. Oh yeah, Mike Mentzer got 5th. Well, whatever. We talked about that last week. So what happened at the 1980 Olympia? Mentzer was predicted to win, like I said. Arnold shows up out of shape, tense atmosphere. Mentzer lashes out at Arnold. I don't think Mentzer looks as good when he lashed out as Arnold as he thinks he looks. We're going to listen to what he says here. I have a video clip here. And then Arnold ends up winning. And then we're going to talk about the fallout of what happened. Now, there may be ads in this video because this is I'm signed into Google, but not with my account, not with my premium account. But whatever, it'll be fine. Let's see what Mentzer has to say about this competition. So if you're listening, this is a video. These are behind the scenes of the 1980 Olympia contest. A dramatic sound and a shot of the Sydney Opera House, because it did take place in Sydney, Australia. Okay.
I remember most clearly speaking with Jacques Blomart the day before the show at Paul Grant's gym. He was very concerned. He was concerned that his friend Arnold was going to destroy his legend. He was very, very concerned, as his friend's concerned. He told me that, in fact, Arnold told him he was going to go on the show, and now he tried to talk him out of it. So it didn't bother me to hear that he was going to go on the show, especially in lesser conditions, but even if he had been in good condition, it wouldn't bother me. The morning of the show, the atmosphere was much different. There was a tension there. There was a hostility and negativity that skewed everyone's normal perception and, of course, prevented anyone from deriving the pleasure they might have had otherwise. Everything was askew at this point. It was not a normal.
So I think that's an important point. But before the event, because they know that Arnold's in the competition, everybody's tense. Nobody's having fun simply because one guy, Arnold Schwarzenegger, happens to be there. I think that's very telling. Just make a note of that, please. All right, let's continue.
Contest. No one was talking or acting as the way they usually do. There was a strain and tension in the air all the way through. Then the issue of the weight classes came up.
I mean, isn't that interesting? Like, what do you do when there's strain or tension in the air? How do you respond to that? How do you deal with that? I mean, not Mike Mentzer here, but you in your own life. It's just something to ask yourself. What does that mean if there's strain or tension? I mean, more specifically, this is about psychology. What does that mean about you? I think that's very... Oh, okay. I just think these things are extremely interesting. And people listen to this and they don't even think about it. Because they have girlfriends. But okay, but I'm the guy without the girlfriend. Okay.
There was a lot of arguing going on between Arnold and a few of the guys. I wasn't even concerned about that. I didn't care one way or the other. I thought I could win. It was a very large room. There must have been maybe 50 or 60.
I guess my point is, okay, so Mentzer's saying these things. Arnold shows up. There's tension. I didn't care about that because I had the best body. I knew I was going to win. I think there's something going on here. And this is aside the point, but I think there's probably something going on here that Mentzer's just not aware of and he can't speak to because I don't think he's tuned into these things. You could call it politics. I don't know. But when people are tuned out, they don't tell you they're tuned out. They leave clues to let you know. Like if somebody's a narcissist, they don't tell you they're narcissists, they leave you clues. I responded to this tweet. This guy said, like, he had a son and he said, oh, this my brand new son, fills a hole in my heart I didn't even know was there. You got to hear how narcissists talk because they don't come out and say I'm a narcissist, but they say stuff like that. I'm not saying if you say that you're necessarily a narcissist, but there's clues, right? And I think there's lots of clues Not in what Menser is saying here, but what he isn't saying. And I wouldn't be making a big deal about this, but we know what's coming. Menser's going to blow up in Arnold. He thinks he's going to look better than he does. I don't know.
People in there, and Arnold, as usual, wanted to be the center of attention. But he had said something.
Most people have no clue that in 2023, the best way to make money on Amazon is
Gotta
not
deal with ads.
physical products.
Guys want to make money on Amazon?
It's Amazon.
You could probably do that. Oh. Sorry.
Denigrate Amir Badu in front of everyone, something that was uncalled for. He was making a fool out of himself, but at that time I wasn't concerned. I thought
He denigrated Samir in front of everybody, something that was uncalled for, but here's a picture of them at the competition. I'm guessing Arnold's ragging on people, because that seems to be what he does. I mean, just, what I gathered from Pumping Iron about how Arnold was at this time. He's probably just banter, a little bit more jocular than a lot of people are comfortable with. But it's something where if he had an older brother, it's nothing new. I'm guessing. Let's see what else he has to say.
Amir Badu wanted to defend himself. That was his business. So he was going through his annex. At one point, Boyer Co. stood up as a gentleman and said, look, why don't we just let Arnold explain to all of us right here, right now, what his reasons are for wanting to have weight classes. Maybe we can get to the bottom of this instead of arguing aimlessly. And he did say it in a very gentlemanly fashion. There was no hint of malice or anything negative in his voice. And Arnold snapped back, oh, Boyer, why don't you stop acting like a baby?
No. He told Boyer Co. Arnold Schwarzenegger told Boyer Co. to stop acting like a baby. Oh, what a controversy. Like that's some big deal. I mean, I guess you had to be there, but I doubt that scene. That just doesn't sound malicious, not even a little bit. Arnold, I don't know if you got what was going on here, but there used to be 2 weight classes. They're going to 1. Arnold's the only one who wanted 2 weight classes, and he wasn't really giving good reasons for it. This is an indication. Mike Menser's explicating why there was maybe tension, or there's a culmination of the tension that was already there.
Grow up and be a man, which I thought was uncalled for. So I
Uncalled for? You the church lady? Okay.
said, look, Boyer Co. said that as a gentleman, something to that effect. He doesn't deserve that. And that pissed him off. He turned around very rapidly to face me, and he literally had his upper lip was furled around he was snarling like an animal. He said, oh, come on, Menser, we all know that you lost last year because of your big belly. And I allowed that to irritate me perhaps.
I allowed that to irritate me perhaps too much. Move my face back over here, actually. I allowed that to irritate me perhaps too much. Please make a note of Menser saying that. And when we talk about how you propagandize yourself, when you focus on things outside of you as opposed to what's going on within you, that is a perfect example of it. I mean, you'll see here that Menser is going on and on about Menser, or about Schwarzenegger, the tension, what he's saying to other people, his banter, how, it offends Menser's sensibilities. But that is the key issue. If Menser wants to learn and grow from this, you look at, why did you allow that to irritate you too much? What's going on with you? That's the gold. That's the growth. And when you don't do that, or if you subscribe to a philosophy, I'm going to argue that makes it less likely that you're going to do something like that. Then, it's just life. It's not that like you're not going to, don't want to be dramatic about it. Like, oh, you're going to be unhappy for the rest of your life. I mean, it's not like that, although I do think Menser did probably struggle with happiness given some of the things we'll talk about. You're just not going to grow. So Menser's going on for, there's 8.5 minutes here of clips, or 8 minutes, 50 seconds here of clips, That's what you need to be talking about for the entire 8 minutes. But we'll see.
On impulse, I ran over towards him. I was surprised. Arnold Schwarzenegger sat down.
Please note what Arnold is wearing versus what Menser is wearing. Arnold looks like a cool 80s guy. Menser looks like he smells like a gym sock. I mean, fascinating that. So it's like, I can't believe I didn't even realize this until now. I mean, how many times have I seen this picture? So this is the picture of Menser confronting Arnold at this, when they're arguing about the weight classes. It was the same shot with that picture of Arnold shaking hands with Samir, because there's Samir and there's Arnold. So they're all in the same position.
Scared him. He went over and sat in the corner, and when he went to sit down, I continued at him. I was wagging my finger at him.
You wagging? You scared him? You're wagging your finger at him? Who are you? Why would you think that's a good thing? I mean, what does that say about your psychology that you think that's a good thing, that you're scaring this guy who, I don't know, maybe he coked up a little bit, as Menser will say later, and I don't know. I mean, we'll get to it. But the reason why I'm calling attention to all this, because this will come back later. So I just want to make a note of it.
Telling him that his behavior was reprehensible, that it was not boy or co who needed to grow up, but him. And he could look me in the eye. He literally went from being a frantic, hysterical adolescent to shrinking away like an injured child. And that's really gives you some indication, some clues to his character. Only once I stood.
It does. It does give you some indication, some clues to Schwarzenegger's character. And I'm not going to defend Schwarzenegger as, the epitome of what a man's character needs to be. But what about your character, Menser? God, it's just so okay. I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but I just can't help it. It's so easy to just, look at all these things going on outside of me. And it's not that you're wrong. And I'm not saying Menser's analysis of this is wrong. But where do you put your attention? What matters? What really matters?
Stood up at the pre-judging meeting. Did that thing come to at least a partial halt? That irritated Ben Weider.
So that's the pre-judging meeting. And I'm guessing that those guys in the background, those are judges, and they were there, and they saw that whole thing. I think that's when Menser lost the competition.
He stood in between Arnold and I and tried to assert himself. I just remember thinking how out of control he was. And equally as interesting was how out of control Ben Weider and the hierarchy of the IFBB were. I thought these were supposed to be the guys that ran the show. But here you had this big Prussian son of a bitch standing up acting like a Nazi. And Ben Weider, who had previously always seemed to pride himself on being in control of things.
All right, so Menser's realizing that the IFBB is not in control. Arnold is now bigger than the IFBB, the International Federation of Bodybuilding. And he came in and he's running the show. Okay, so that's Menser's gripe. What's next? Oh yeah. So Arnold's predicted to win. So that was that. Let's go to the next slide. So yeah, the thing I wanted to note here, I think, is not that this slide contains everything that happens, but you show up to a contest. Do you think that the bodybuilding contest is simply about who has the best body? Do you think it's about getting a perfect score? Menser, we know you can do that, but can you put on a pair of decent clothes? Because, yes, we are judging who has the best body, but we're also judging, right? It's like we talked about last week. the guy on the statue of the Mr. Olympia statue, the Super Bowl of bodybuilding is Eugene Sandow, and he was not a bodybuilder. Guys, like I made the point last week, he was more of the Ziz than anything else. He was a guy who promoted physical culture. He had Sandow had a great body for the time. I mean, for now. He was a guy who went around and promoted physical culture. Now, that is ultimately what the Olympia judges are looking for on some level, whether they acknowledge it to themselves or not. That is what they're looking for. And yeah, I mean, Arnold has his issues, I'm sure, and it came later. I mean, I actually just read this interview with him. It was in the Atlantic, and he's just, I don't want to get into it now. I mean, I'm sure he has his issues, not any more or any less than most guys do, than I have my own issues. But it's just Arnold's issues come out in a certain way, and just to focus on that years later, I think that is a good indication of why you didn't get the Olympia, like Metzer, is because they need to put somebody up on stage to sell physical culture. And ultimately, are they going to put up somebody who smells like a gym sock, who looks like they smell like a gym sock, or some guy with a sweet, unbuttoned shirt, looking like a sweet 80s guy? So the fallout to this, to the 80 Olympias, Metzer is bitter years later. I mean, I think there's more to that interview. There's more interviews online. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but you can hear the bitterness in his voice. Metzer belittles bodybuilding. He's always belittling bodybuilding as a social ritual. So I was like, to prepare for this, I was listening to whatever clips or interviews I could of Metzer. And by the way, Metzer says some great things, and he makes a lot of great points about bodybuilding. And I think his method has a lot of merit. His heavy duty method, you can learn more about it, but he always needs to make this point of bodybuilders go to the gym to socialize, and how that's a negative thing. It's like, why would that be a negative thing? Hey, that's important. Maybe that's an important part of the culture, of physical culture, is being able to connect with the guys there about bodybuilding, and not just going to get the best workout you possibly can. I mean, yeah, do that, but it's just one of these indications that I think there is this whole realm, this whole dimension of bodybuilding that Metzer didn't get, and it's not on the scorecards, but you have to assume that that's what they're judging for. And I think this is one of the problems with objectivism, and not just objectivism. We're going to talk more about objectivism, but just, especially a certain kind of guy, like an intellectual guy who can get very rigid. He is a difficulty scene. Okay, 1 second, guys. I'm going to be right back. I'm going to pause this. Alright, and I'm back. Had to go do some stuff. So, yeah, there are rumors of can we at least admit that there are rumors of Metzer's downfall? That things didn't seem to work out too well for him after the 1980 Olympia. And you can even hear the bitterness in his voice. Here's Tom Platz talking about it.
About Mike's stomach. Arnold said, "Hey, you have a fat stomach anyhow." And Mike's like this. I'm like, oh my God. Mike carried that bitterness with him. But Mike was the next.
So he was referencing the fat stomach comment. Yep. Platz was there at the 80 Olympia, so.
Next Mr. Olympia. Mike was the golden child. Mike was senior editor in fitness of Muscle and Fitness magazine. He was an intellectual guy, the intellectual bodybuilder, the very smart bodybuilder. I'm like, wow, how great is this? If Mike would have just said, "Arnold, congratulations, good job," next year would have been his, or next year would have been his.
Yep.
In other words, he got upset and carried this bitterness. When you carry bitterness, it's bad. It's like cancer. It probably causes cancer. Your attitude, your negative energy probably makes your whole body do weird stuff.
Yep.
Because if you think bad and expect bad and feel bad,
Okay, so that's just Tom Platz making my point. We don't have to... He just talks about, yeah, you carry bitterness. It's just not good for you. I mean, Tom Platz is a mindset guy. He would say, just let it go, whatever. But I would argue that it's actually built into the philosophy of objectivism implicitly that you can at least be excused for carrying around this bitterness with you. And look, it makes sense that there would be a downfall here because Mentzer at the 1980 Olympia and dealing with Arnold and Ben Weider and the IFBB, he's up against an evil. And Mentzer, I mean, he doesn't say it in that clip. He may say it later on in that clip, but he said it multiple times. He accuses them of being evil. Of Ben Weider, the IFBB, Schwarzenegger, they're evil. But he can't articulate what that evil is. He just says it's evil. He would maybe put it in vague terms of, oh, it's politics, oh, it's rigged, there's corruption, but he wouldn't be able to put it in terms of what that evil is. It's, in favor of subjectivity over objectivity. Well, yeah, but as Mentzer says, rightly so, if it exists in reality, it can be viewed and judged objectively. Right? The subjective exists in reality. Let's view the subjective objectively. Let's see what it's there. So if you think that there's just this evil force out there, according to Mentzer's view, that it can just come over and not ruin your career, but, really serve as an injustice, really serve as a major injustice in your life. How could it not lead to some kind of downfall? I mean, I know Mentzer went on to start he had a training business. He had some kind of mail order training business. I think he probably did okay, but there were some rumors there later in life. Things weren't going well. You can go look those up for yourself. Well, he was about the same age as Arnold, and at least compared to Arnold, I mean, their lives just went in two completely different directions. So, yeah. So this is all backdrop, lead us into the psychology problem with objectivism. We'll talk about, some of the problems, and this will go into dovetail into the crux of the issue. We'll refine these points until we get to the crux of the issue, and then I'll conclude this section with a little discussion about how I think objectivism is. There's a lot of good things in this philosophy, but it is incomplete. And it's incomplete to the extent that it actually will hurt itself. And it's one of the reasons why I think objectivism is not more popular than it is. And then we're going to talk about takeaways and how this comes up in other situations, this issue, and what to do about it. Because this, you're going to be in Mentzer's situation. If you haven't been in Mentzer's situation yet, you will be eventually. And you need to know how to deal with it. Because if you don't deal with it well, it's just really not going to have the life that you want. So there's a psychology problem. When objectivists moralize others or sin, or when others sin, or make errors, they tend to moralize them. This stems from the fact value problem that we talked about last week. Knowledge error necessarily leads to a moral error. Right? They don't just say, they don't just judge actions. They say, well, if you hold certain ideas, and not everybody, by the way, not everybody holds certain wrong ideas, not everybody is morally bad, but just some people. And they're never clear on how you judge somebody exactly to be morally wrong if they hold wrong knowledge. Some people, if they hold wrong knowledge, then they are, in fact, in a moral error. They are evil, and they use that word, very loosely. They are evil. And this is based on this thing in induction, or this thing in objectivism, it's their view on induction. They think it is, and I agree with their view on how induction works. I think that's pretty clear. But it's not the only way to carry out induction. And I don't know, objectivists, you kind of admit that when you say, well, some people we can judge them for having wrong ideas. We can judge them as bad, evil people. But other people we can't. Well, how exactly do you determine that? They say, well, if the person's the leader of some movement. So, if you're just some Marxist kid in school learning ideas and walking around and claiming to everybody you're a Marxist, they would say, well, you're probably not evil. But if you're the leader of some Marxist movement and you can be aware of all the facts of all what Marxism did throughout the 20th century and you're still a Marxist, then you're necessarily an evil person. But I think this is most likely a projection on the objectivist part. But it's all based on their view of induction, that you are totally in control of the view of induction, and it's this very clear linear process. And, that's just not true. Like with procedural knowledge, with Francis Crick, those examples that we talked about last week. Do you have total control of your volition? You definitely have some control over your volition, but to say that you have total control over your volition is false. It's clearly false in Mike Mentzer's life. He got more irritated than he, quote, should have. Right? Why did you get more irritated than you should have? That's what you spend the 10 minutes talking about when you want to grow and move on from this and learn whatever you can, so you don't end up a husk of a person. I mean, just look at how Schwarzenegger, how Schwarzenegger looked throughout the 90s. They're relatively the same age. In fact, Mentzer's a little bit younger. Through how Arnold looked throughout the 90s, how Schwarzenegger looked throughout, versus how Mentzer looked throughout the 90s. I mean, there was clearly, Mentzer just wasn't looking that great. It wasn't moving that well. I don't know. I know there are issues there, right? So obviously, Mentzer, you need to admit in your own life that you're not 100% in control of your volition. There are eruptions from your unconscious. There are unconscious emotions that drive your action. And we know, but because we don't have action without emotion. You need to care about something to do something. Action doesn't exist without emotion. And if you're taking actions that you don't want to take, by definition, it's unconscious. Of course, you're in control of your volition to some extent. You need to be, otherwise philosophy and psychology wouldn't even be interesting subjects. And then I talked last week about my dealings with prominent objectivists and how, some of the most unprofessional responses I've gotten from people ever has come from objectivists. What they accuse me of without even knowing who I am, and clearly without reading what I sent them, it's laughable. They are caricatures of themselves. So, this part 2 of the psychology problem with objectivism. So yeah, philosophy begets psychology. And I think objectivists do a very good job of showing how your philosophical premises can affect your psychology. And that's important. And they do a great job with that. But there's really no understanding of how psychology affects your philosophy. And this comes down to something called the spiral theory of knowledge, where, you ask yourself, what comes first? Is it like if you're going to study philosophy or psychology, do you start with studying psychology, human psychology, or do you start with studying philosophy? And that's a great argument to have, because there's really no answer, because you can go back and forth and make points either way. You need psychology to study philosophy, and you need philosophy to study psychology. It's the same thing with philosophy and history. You learn about philosophy and what men, quote, should do. You learn about normative ethics and things like that by studying history. History is when you study what man does. But when you study what man does, you study what man is, and this implies a philosophy. So when you're studying history, there are implications there. So that when you go and now study philosophy, you make those implications explicit. And then when you study philosophy more, there's more historical implications that when you go back and study history, you make those implications explicit. It goes back and forth, and these two fields build upon each other. And it's the same thing with psychology and philosophy. How man relates with reality versus how man relates with himself. You really can't have one without the other. And in objectivism, there is no acknowledgement of this. That there's simply a view that psychology is this passive thing that you can kind of control from your conscious mind completely. Which is why they implicitly, it's not an official endorsement of cognitive behavioral therapy, but that's what a lot of famous objectivists, prominent objectivist psychologists endorse. They implicitly endorse some kind of cognitive behavioral therapy. Because from their view, they can't really look at eruptions from the unconscious, because that may imply that we don't have volition, or that may imply that we are irrational. If that's true, then by their view of induction, objectivism loses some ground. But it clearly doesn't. I mean, they have one view of induction. It's not, like I said. So the fact value debate between Peikoff and Kelly that we talked about last week, right? There is no dichotomy philosophically between fact and morality. Philosophically, if you're analyzing somebody philosophically. But if you're going to analyze them psychologically, then there needs to be some kind of dichotomy, because you can't know all the facts, right? And this is projection. I think I say it here. Or maybe I don't say it here. But this is projection. And so this is all aggravated by the fact that objectivists have standards. Whereas a lot of people, their cop-out is, well, they just don't have standards and they don't judge at all. Well, at least objectivists, stay in the ring and say, no, we have standards. We're going to judge you as morally wrong because of these beliefs that you hold. But, where was I going with this? Oh yeah, so psychologically, you can't judge people based on their ideas, because what you're saying to do otherwise is a projection. It's another eruption from the unconscious. And that's what objectivists do all the time. They say, oh, you're some leader of a Marxist movement, for example. The only way you could be a Marxist, in the 21st century, after all the horrors of Marxism in the 20th century, is if you were actually evil. You should know better. But you don't know that because you don't have all the facts of their psychology and what Marxism does for each person psychologically. Only they know that, or only their therapist or priest would know that. You are in no position to make that kind of judgment about their character simply because they hold certain ideas. What you are saying, in effect, and why it's a projection, is if I was in your situation, if I was you, if I was out promoting pro-Marxist ideas or pro-Christian ideas, whatever objectivism is against, that I would be immoral. I would be evil. And that's true. Given what your premises are, some of them unspoken, if you were promoting these ideas, you would be evil. But you're not them. And to assume that you know what's going on with people psychologically, and then to assume what their character is because of that, and then the assumption that you make of their character, calling them evil, just allows you to dismiss them. You wonder why people don't like objectivists? I mean, is it any surprise? And so often when you ask objectivists something like, why don't you think objectivism was more popular? They always... their answer is typically some kind of eruption from the unconscious. Some kind of denial of the fact that psychology exists. Or something that implies that psychology doesn't exist. Like, oh, well, the world is so backwards, or the world is so wrong, or people evade the truth. Yeah, well, you know who else is evading the truth is you. And that's the crux of this, is objectivism. Their cardinal sin is invasion of the facts of reality. Denial, in effect. That's the cardinal sin of objectivism. And this is exactly what objectivists do when they commit this error. The world is evil, or people are irrational, and that's why objectivism isn't popular, or people evade. No, you are in fact evading the power of the unconscious. The power of unconscious emotions and the fact that they do exist in all of us. And why wouldn't they exist? That's how we grow. Is because we're up against a situation that we don't know how to deal with, so there's going to be some, some effect to that. And the effect is your brain kind of goes haywire. You're up against a situation that you haven't had to deal with, like Menser at the 1980 Olympia. And I'm not criticizing Menser so much for not getting what was going on that day, but the fact that years later, he still doesn't get it. Years later, he still spends 10 minutes talking about how Arnold was coked up and how he's evil, as opposed to, dude, why did you get more upset? Arnold made fun of your belly. He didn't make fun of your mom or your wife or your children. He didn't threaten them in any way. What's there to get upset about? So objectivism, I think there's a lot of good there, and if you're listening to this and you don't really know anything about objectivism, I would really encourage you to go study it, because there are a lot of good things there, and mostly when people give criticisms of objectivism, it's obvious that they just haven't read it. They don't understand what it is. Like, even guys I would really admire, like Christopher Hitchens, when he's asked to give comments, there's some video of him on YouTube when he's asked to give comments on objectivism objectivism says to be selfish. And he says, well, I don't think people really need to be taught to be selfish. Look around you. People are selfish all the time. It's like, okay, well, I don't want to get into it here, but if that's your criticism, if that's your number one criticism, then you haven't read literally 3 pages into the objectivist ethics. You haven't read it. Because if you read it, it would completely disabuse that critique of it. And with objectivism, there is a denial of the irrational. And you see this, and you see them be irrational because of this. Not that they're more or less irrational. I'm not going to make that point, but you can clearly see Menser be irrational there and avowed objectivist. My dealings with objectivists has made it quite clear to me. Recognizes that psychology exists, but that it's only passive. And because of this, it can't really see psychological truths. It can't. It all it does is it would analyze a Marxist or a Christian from a philosophical perspective. And don't you see how these premises are wrong? Well, that's not why people have premises. That's not why people get into philosophy. A lot of people get into philosophy because it means something for them psychologically. It means something for them to be a Marxist or a Christian. And you don't understand that because you don't have that same thing in your brain, but they do. And they may be wrong, but they still exist, and you need to connect with them as people who exist. Especially since you have the same issue, just not about, deciphering correct philosophical premises. You need to be able to relate, to connect with people. And without this, we're not going to learn and grow. You're going to go to the 1980 Olympia and you're going to project on Schwarzenegger the entire time and call him evil. But you're just saying, if I was in your position, given what I know, I would do something different. But you're not in their position. You're not them. The only one who can really make that judgment is their therapist. Or themselves. And for you to make that judgment on them is a totally off-putting, completely inappropriate, shows inappropriate psychological boundaries and a total lack of psychological identity, which is distinct and different from a philosophical identity. Your conscious philosophical values. Now, as Objectivism points out, those philosophical premises can inform a psychological identity. It implies some kind of psychological identity, but psychology is a different thing. Sorry. You kind of have this like religious psychology with this non-religious premises. I mean, it's like an objectivist finding an objectivist who's a Marxist historian, but a Marxist historian, or has a Marxist interpretation of history. You wouldn't find it. You wouldn't be an objectivist. Well, I'm saying you're doing the same thing with psychology. You have a religious psychology as a result of just not understanding what it is, just all being a result of this philosophy. Yeah. They accuse others, so the other problem with objectivism, so they accuse other philosophies of a false dichotomy between mind and body, throughout the history of philosophy. And they do a really good job with this, and I think this is one of the good things of objectivism. I was also thinking, I gave Peikoff's History of Philosophy and my notes to people who are into philosophy, who've, been studying it for a long time, and it's like, oh wow, this is such great information there, even though they're not objectivists. And I know one guy was even hostile to objectivism. And I think one of the things that objectivists do is they can really break down the history of philosophy into its key concepts so you can understand it. Now, they're not the first ones to do this. I mean, I think they get a lot of that from Vindelbaum, his book that I've recommended before, but now objectivists don't commit this false dichotomy, but they do commit the inverse error, which is a package deal. It's a false conflation, one that says philosophy is psychology. But as I was saying before, spiral theory and knowledge, they're close. They're close. You can't really can't study philosophy without coming to a view of history, and you can't study history without coming to a view of philosophy. They're not the same thing. And we need to recognize how they're totally different. And you're taking your philosophical premises and judging people psychologically because of them, and that's like, that's just like the main thing. Like, that's what you need to do, is you need to connect with people who, like, there's some overlap. If you have, perhaps, revolutionary ideas, what you consider to be revolutionary, it doesn't matter whether they are. But this all started, go back to last week, what we talked about is David Kelly went and spoke with libertarians who objectivists, really, really don't like. Well, there's some overlap in your politics. Yeah, you don't have the same reasoning for your politics, but you can't go talk with them. Does David Kelly go and speak with libertarians and condone everything they do? He's saying no. He's saying we come at it from this certain perspective, and we can help. Let's talk about it. Peikoff says no. Libertarians are evil. Yeah, I wonder why. I wonder why objectivism isn't more popular. Oh, it's because everybody else evades the truth. Or maybe you're evading some truth here. Some psychological truth. And then as I say here, it's a philosophy for living on Earth. That's what Rand says about objectivism. But it's not a philosophy for living with yourself. I know, that's gay, but it's a good point. So what are the takeaways here? What do you do when you fail? Not when you fail so much, but when you experience an injustice, even if the injustice isn't evil. And maybe it isn't evil. What do I say in my book? When you're trying to learn about something psychologically, not philosophically, philosophically, when you approach something, you ask yourself, is this true? That's a great thing to have. That's a great question to have in the back of your mind when you're approaching a situation philosophically. But there's this very related field called psychology. And so if you want to understand psychologically what's going on, you don't ask yourself, is this true? You ask, if this was true, what is it true of? And I think when you look at the 1980 Olympia from that perspective, you go, oh, the IFBB wants somebody who has, like a well-built male physique. But they also want a Eugene Sandow. They want somebody who can go around and sell physical culture. And if you look like a crumb bum, and it's clear you're not really in charge of your emotions, and you have these eruptions when Arnold's, said you had a big belly. You can't even take somebody criticizing you for having a big belly. Well, what's going to happen? What's going to happen when some guy says, oh, well, the only reason you got into bodybuilding to get big muscles is because you have a small dick? How are you going to respond to that? Oh, you're just jealous. You're just jealous of my big... it's just weakness. That's what you would say. And in fact, I've heard Menser say as much in interviews. Like, when people make fun of bodybuilders for being insecure and that's why they need big muscles, his response is, oh, you're the insecure one, actually. You're the one who's jealous of me. What kind of response is that? No, I would much rather trust Arnold in that situation, whatever his character flaws are. Not, is this true? Ask, what is this true of? And how do I relate with that? Because you do. You relate with it to some degree, not to the exact degree. This is how you grow. Is you don't just distance yourself from other people like, oh, at least I'm not that bad. At least I'm not that bad. You go, oh, this guy's complaining about his wife. I don't complain about my wife. Maybe to the extent that he does, and I definitely wouldn't do it in public the way that he does, but where else am I not taking responsibility for my emotions about a certain situation? I do that 10 times a day, but it's impossible to always take responsibility for, you're never going to, go easy on yourself. It's okay. You're going to mess it up. There's no end point to this thing that we're doing here, that this individuation thing that we're doing. When you fail, 2 of 3. Yeah, if you don't do this, you just become a husk of a man. Self-propaganda. Clearly Menser was committing that in that interview. You can go listen to the whole thing. There's more clips about it, but just so much focus on the external. And I'm not, right? He's not wrong. He's right. I'm sure Arnold was coked up. I'm sure there was tension in the air. Isn't that interesting though? Yeah. Why is there tension in the air? Did I bring it back around to that? Dude, you don't know how to deal with tension is what you're saying when there's tension in the air. You don't know how to deal with the tension. You're not identifying and addressing it immediately, which is what you do when you're in tune and connected. I know because I'm tuned out and disconnected, so I have a difficult time with that. Like I'm relating with Menser here, right? I see it. But you got to take responsibility for that. You can't just blame it on Arnold showing up and for it being tension. No, Arnold shows up and you don't know how to deal with the tension. That's what it is. Until it gets to this point where he makes fun of your belly. Like, so what? My nickname in high school was Roid Belly. Because of my roid belly. Because I had kind of a belly. And it's funny. Like, do you not have friends? Do you not have I know you have a brother. Do you not, like, what do you talk about with your friends? Do you just philosophize? You just sit around and rip on each other. It's funny. Oof. So that was a prejudging meeting, so I'm guessing the judges were there. And if you're a judge and you see that, it's over for Menser. We can't have this guy be Sandow. He's not a Sandow. He has a great body, but he's autistic. Yeah. And then, got to develop a psychological identity. When you engage in this process, you develop a psychological identity. And then I think what objectivism needs to do is it needs to, have a view of philosophy, but also how psychology affects philosophy. I know that objectivism doesn't explicitly endorse CBT, and I wouldn't want them to explicitly endorse my view of psychology, but if you're going to implicitly endorse one psychology, CBT is not it. CBT is, you connect with CBT over to the extent that you still have, as Peikoff would say, M1, mildly religious epistemology when it comes to psychology. And because of this, because you can acknowledge to the extent that psychology does affect our philosophy, or at least it can, not all the time, but at least it can. And who determines whether it does? It's up to you. It's up to you and your therapist, you and your priest, you and your objectivist mentor, however that works. It's up to you. So I think it's just part of ethics. Once you understand the power of this, it's part of a rational ethic to be in a process of managing your psychological issues for what they are. Acknowledging there are irrational parts of you at all times. And that's usually a good sign, because it means you're growing and evolving. Of course, you're going to be irrational in a situation you don't understand. That's how you know you need to grow. That's okay. It's not a sin to be irrational. It's a sin to deny the fact that you are irrational. It's a sin to be a spokesperson for objectivism. And then when some guy emails you, or first he calls you on the phone and says, "Hey, I have this view of psychology. You may be interested." And you say, "Yeah, sure, send it over. I'll take a look." And then the email that he receives back is accusing him of projection. No, repression. Yeah, it's accusing him of repression. Come on, guys. So what are some examples of this? So this, I have connection with what Mincer went through, because he was 29 and I was 29 when I went to grad school. I thought the point of grad school was, hey, I'm going to make these awesome points and argue, and everybody's going to see how awesome I am. I still think that. I still think that's the true thing. But then I realized, that's really not the point of grad school. The point of grad school is to get along with other people, because when you're in one of these programs, they last several years and they want to be able to get along with you. And so I thought what I was doing was arguing, and my arguments were correct, especially against the social justice warrior, that the critical race theory. I was there at more of the advent of it. You need to ask, okay, maybe these, this view of psychology that is being promulgated by this institution, maybe it's wrong. But if it is true, what is it true of? And that, just taking that perspective really helped me. It really helped me develop my view of emotions and how they work. Because I was, when I went into grad school, I was just implicitly going to be a CBT guy. But because I didn't ignore the Marxists, and I didn't say, the Frankfurt School, that they took hold in Columbia University initially, so, it's going to be worse here, and, it's not my fault. And instead of saying that, I said, okay, I know this is true of something. What is this true of? And oh yeah, what critical race theory is about, what wokeism is about, is emotional validation. People not feeling validated emotionally. Now, you come up with all these crazy theories in order to do that, but obviously the theories aren't right, but you need to understand where people are coming from. And because I was able to do that, it's like, not only did I move beyond grad school and what happened and, how I got kicked out, but now it's like, if that didn't happen, I would have just been maybe some CBT schmuck. I don't know. But you listen to what they're saying. You understand, you relate. It's really tough to do, because this is a situation where I could have, made excuses the rest of my life and people would have let me. Just like Menser at the 1980 Olympia. This also occurs, with nice guy syndrome. This is another common example. You think women don't like you because you're nice. Well, that doesn't make sense. And then they go like this jerk. Well, you look at the truth of what's going on and you're probably not nice. You're insecure. Right? So you act nice to cover up your insecurities. And this is a really difficult one for some guys to get over, because they have their whole morality built up around covering up their insecurities, is essentially what this amounts to. Do you want to admit that to yourself? I mean, it's a lot easier to admit that to yourself when you're 22 as opposed to when you're 29, You're not nice. You're insecure. And being nice is your way of not looking or thinking that you're hiding your insecurity, but you're not. It's just implied. It's like the agenda is implied in all your actions, and it chases girls away. I mean, girls can't stand it. They would rather be, even a healthy girl, even a girl who has healthy attachments, if she was given the choice between the nice guy syndrome thing, the one-itis thing, and some guy who abuses her to some degree, she would probably go with the guy who abuses her emotionally. Like, well, at least says who he is. Or with your father, guys have resentment about their father. We can focus so much on, look at what my father did to hurt me. And you look at the facts of the situation, you analyze it like a lawyer or a judge in the court of law, and you say, yeah, your father did A, B, and C, and that's not your fault. It's not your responsibility that you have those issues now because of your father. You're not responsible for the fact that your father did that, of course. But those issues, now that issue is put inside of you, that is and you're an adult now, that is 100% your issue to deal with. And there's no way around that. And you can talk all day about what your father did to hurt you. Menser can talk all day about what a jerk Schwarzenegger is and how weak Ben Weider and the IFBB is. Great, but that's not the issue. That's not the psychological issue. And you will not grow psychologically unless you admit that, this is really about my resentment I have towards myself. It's meta in a way. My resentment towards my father is really the resentment I have towards myself about having resentment towards my father. It's because, in a sense, I don't know how to manage anger well. Spoiler alert. That's what's going to happen. Or that's the truth of your resentment issues and why you have problems mostly with people, in your family or people who are close to you. And I've noticed this thing with objectivists. They don't like to forgive that much. They really like to hold on to, I'm not going to forgive somebody because if I forgive somebody, then that's like giving them a sanction for what they did. No, you're not doing that. You're not forgiving somebody for themselves or for the other person. You're forgiving them for yourself. And you're not going to make yourself forgive somebody when you don't feel like it. I wouldn't say to do that, but you work on your anger issue, and I guarantee you'll get to the place where the forgiveness of your father, whatever he did to you, will be quite natural. And it's tough because, fathers really do things to hurt us. Fathers, abuse us and touch touch their children in inappropriate ways. It's dark. Okay. If you want to hold on to it, you can continue to hold on to it. Or with BPD girl. Guys end up with BPD girl, and there's a great analysis of her and all her problems and how to spot a BPD girl. But what about you? Why were you with her in the first place? And some guys will take some responsibility for this. They say like, oh, I was in a low point in my life, and so I was going out to a lot of bars, and that's where I met her. You're more likely to meet BPD girl at a bar, which is true. But what are you really going through? How do you really take responsibility for the emotions of why you needed a girl like that? Because the truth is why were you with her? It's because you were tuned out of your emotions. And so you needed a girl who seemed to at least be tuned into her emotions very well, to be overly emotional, which can be associated with borderline, to say the least, right? And also, because you're tuned out, you didn't see the clues. You were totally unaware of the clues. I mean, why do some guys never meet borderline girls? Well, they do meet them, but they just, the borderline girl says something just a little bit too emotive when they first meet them, perhaps, and they go, well, this is not a good situation. It's starting a little bit too much drama right away and trying to get you involved. Yeah, you need to get involved emotionally in her life because you're not involved emotionally in your own life. Because you've been reading Epictetus for the last 8 years. Same thing with the culture wars. This is the trans debate, right? The trans debate is you're wrong for transitioning children. And I agree, that's wrong. Versus the other side who says, well, this feels right to me, and who are you to say? In truth, this comes down to our inability to differentiate between philosophy and psychology. I don't think we know what emotions are, as a culture, and so when it comes to emotional issues like transitioning from one gender to another, or at least pretending like you do, I think what you see is, it makes total sense that somebody would transition to, even for the hint of feeling emotionally whole and validated. Because they don't know how to do that any other way. And you don't know how to do it any other way either. You just tell them that they're wrong for doing it. Well, that's not the crux of the issue. We're just talking past each other. The one side thinks philosophy is more important. Theology perhaps is more important. The other thinks that philosophy mistakes philosophy for psychology. The other one, vice versa, thinks that psychology is philosophy. And of course, this happens in politics, right? I mean, this one gets everyone. Eventually, it got Arnold, right? He went in. I remember the recall election in 2003, and he went in. And he's going to clean house in Sacramento, and the teachers' union got 3 times the size. Or, it just had the complete opposite effect because Arnold didn't realize, or maybe he did, he just didn't care, I don't know, but a bureaucracy doesn't exist to, it's impossible, same thing with neurosis. Bureaucracy is a neurosis. I think I made a tweet about this last week or so, but you don't stamp out a neurosis like you don't stamp out a bureaucracy. You don't go in and clean house. You don't go in and clean house in your neurosis. You understand why it exists, and then you get the neurosis to work against itself. And that's how you would work on a bureaucracy. But because Arnold didn't recognize the point of that, the point of this bureaucracy, the point of politics is for the group to perpetuate itself, then you just get the exact opposite outcome. Very similar like in Nixon, Oliver Stone's Nixon, which, well, okay, so there's that scene where Nixon, played by Anthony Hopkins, was out on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial talking with the protesters, the Vietnam War protesters, right to their face. He got out of the car. And I guess that really happened. I think it was a little bit less impromptu than they made it appear in the movie. But yeah, there was this point when Nixon just went up to the protesters at the Lincoln Memorial and say, "What do you want?" And there's a point when one of the female protesters was, asking Nixon questions, and he was responding, but he wasn't really responding in a way that made it seem like they didn't really make sense. And she realized, oh my God, you're not in charge. You're not in charge of whether we stay in Vietnam or remove our troops. There's something else here. Right? And that was the apotheosis of the movie. That's when Nixon realized he wasn't in charge. And there's this huge bureaucracy, there's this huge engine that is working to perpetuate itself. In part, you could say it's a military-industrial complex. Right? And if you go into therapy without recognition of the power of these complexes, that you can't just stamp them out, that you can't just, if you just have an irrational emotion like jealousy, you can't just argue it out of existence. Oh, well, don't you see how it doesn't make sense that this jealousy is irrational? You don't even want to be with your ex-girlfriend anyway. You're the one who broke up with her. She's not a good situation. Why would you be jealous if you are out of the bar and you see her with some other guy? That's irrational. That doesn't make sense. Don't you see it? And this is how objectivists deal with psychology. They implicitly endorse CBT. Same thing, right? And I've just finished Notes from a Dead House, a Dostoevsky novel, I guess you could say, which serves as an inflection point. Curiously enough, Dostoevsky was 29 when he went to prison, when he went to the labor prison. Yeah, I can't do these videos much more than an hour. This prison in Siberia, in Omsk, which is a great city to put in your weather app just to see what the weather's like there and what Dostoevsky went through. It gets cold in the winter, P.S. It actually doesn't get as cold as something like a place like Yakutsk, because Omsk is in southern Siberia. But Dostoevsky was a nobleman. He saw himself as above the other prisoners. They were all, to put it in modern terms, they were all working class guys. They were all serfs. And he was disgusted by them. Like, why would you drink? Why would you gamble? Why would you work so hard to make all this money and then go and gamble it away? Why would you work so hard for this money and then go and spend it all on vodka and then get punished because you're not supposed to have vodka? Why would you do these things? And I think just through his immersion in the prison, I don't think Dostoevsky, he was a great psychologist, but he really didn't put it in definite terms. I think he basically saw, I do all the things that I criticize these serfs for doing, these people who I see as lower class, these working class people, I do the same thing. Like the self-sabotage. That essentially is why you would work really hard to make all this money in the prison, which you could do, and then just blow it all on vodka and just reach this oblivion. That's self-sabotage. Eventually, Dostoevsky was able to see, this is what I do. This is what we all do. And that's why he went from some piddling writer to the greatest novelist of the 19th century. It's because he was able to make these connections. He was able to see the psychological nuance. And I think it made him more conscious. I think it made all of us more conscious. Because without Dostoevsky and Nietzsche to some degree, there wouldn't have been Jung. And the thing about Jung is people accuse him of starting a religion, but in truth he did much more. He did much more than start a religion. He started the religion being lowercase. Emphasis on the. He made everybody more conscious because of that. So, what's going to be your growth? What's going to happen to you that's really going to be your make or break moment, when it comes to your adult life? It's probably happened maybe a couple times already. It'll keep happening, by the way, until you resolve this issue. It'll be a great injustice. Yeah, I don't know exactly what it'll be, but it'll be a great injustice at a time when you deserve to receive a great reward. It will be outside of your control. Later, you're going to look back on it and realize there's nothing you could have done. Given where you were psychologically, there's nothing you could have done. And other people will give you a pass. People, whenever Menser is complaining about the 1980 Olympia, the interviewers always responds, "Oh, geez, really? That happened? Oh, that's so terrible. Oh, my God, yeah." The implication is you deserve to complain about this. 10, 15 years later, you deserve to complain about this. Yeah, that's tough. And I noticed, when I first got kicked out of school, people who typically wouldn't give me a pass were giving me a pass. And it's easy to take that pass. And it's really, you want to take it, but you want to have a life too. So yeah, what Menser's success would have been is just to look at exactly everything that we talked about. If Arnold was the rightful winner of the 1980 Olympia, what would need to be true about bodybuilding and your profession and your approach to this? What would need to be true? And just integrate those beliefs into your worldview. You don't have to believe them. You don't have to agree with them to the same extent that other people do, but can you consider it? So, what do you do? So the recap here is, due to the rigidity in objectivism, they're only able to engage with other people in a certain context. This leads to judgmentalism, necessarily isolation, and you don't have the influence that you think that you would have. And worse than that, the philosophy of objectivism actually impedes people, as we can see from Menser. It impedes people. It impedes objectivists from growing psychologically, which just brings the entire movement down, and you're just caught in these spirals of calling people irrational. Yeah, people don't being called irrational without reason. People don't being called evil without reason, just because if you held the views that they had, if you were in their position, you would be evil. That doesn't mean they're evil. And yeah, this is at the root of the culture war. Well, I don't have to belabor this point. It's just understanding the difference between psychology and philosophy. And then the way through this, of course, the first thing we need to do is we need to identify exactly what emotions are. These eruptions are unconscious actions, and we don't have actions without emotions. You're not going to act unless you care. You're not going to care without emotions. So we got to look at unconscious emotions. But first, before we look at unconscious emotions, we need to look at emotions, what they are, how they work. This indicates exactly how we talk through them. And this allows us to engage in a process through which we make, we get our willpower back. We expand the power of our volition. And let me know, what did I get right? What was impactful? I appreciate your criticisms as well. If you want to learn more about my theory of psychology, AmosEmpire.com/book. I think there's a link to the Amazon page in the description. And of course, if you want to reach out, learn more about the therapy that I do, or, just ask me questions, argue, AmosEmpire.com/schedule. Thank you guys. And I wish you all the pain and joy that comes when you face a situation that you previously did not understand.